They called her Nanny. Lenny Baucom Hudgens stood 4.5 feet tall, lived in the hills of McDowell County, North Carolina, and she knew a remedy for every ailment a human body could produce. By the time she died, almost nobody else did. Today we're walking through Nanny's tradition, the 5 cultures that built it, the plants that powered it, and the 1929 trial that quietly buried it. Stay with me. The story of Appalachian granny medicine doesn't start in Appalachia. It starts in 3 places at once. The first was the British Isles. Scots-Irish settlers brought a folk healing tradition, centuries old, what scholars now call cunning folk. The second was Pennsylvania. German migrants in the 1700s brought a Christian folk practice called Braucherei, sometimes called powwow. The third was the southern Appalachian Mountains themselves, where the Cherokee and the Choctaw had been combining the plants of these mountains with spiritual ritual long before any European arrived. What happened in the back country between 1760 and 1860 was that all 3 of these traditions ran into each other. And when enslaved Africans brought a 4th tradition, root work, herbal knowledge, ritual, the Southern Appalachians ended up with a folk medicine system that had 5 cultural fingerprints layered on top of each other. That 5-culture syncretic system is what we now call granny medicine. And for the next 120 years, it was the only medicine most rural Appalachian families ever had. Most Americans, asked about Appalachian folk medicine, will give you the surface version. Old wives' tales, bear grease for arthritis, maybe a vague memory of the Foxfire book from a school library. That version isn't wrong, it's just shallow. Here's the part the History Channels skip. The granny tradition wasn't a quaint folkway. It was a full shadow medical system. It operated in parallel to licensed medicine for roughly 120 years, from the 1860s to about 1980. In early 20th century Eastern Kentucky, granny women outnumbered doctors 14-1, not a typo. 14-1. In counties where licensed physicians were either unavailable, geographically unreachable, or financially unaffordable. And most rural Appalachian counties were all 3. Your family's first call wasn't a doctor. It was a granny. The U.S. medical establishment knew about this system since the 1880s, and starting in the late 1920s, they made an active, documented decision to drive it out of existence. The first public moment came in 1929, in York, Pennsylvania. We'll get there. So who actually built this system? 5 distinct traditions layered in the same mountain valleys over 2 centuries. The Cherokee and the Choctaw were first. Their plant knowledge was already in place when the first European settlers arrived. They knew which plants pulled fever down. They knew which plants stopped bleeding. Most of this was held in oral tradition. Most was lost. Some survived by being absorbed by the people who came next. The Scots-Irish and the English settlers were the next layer. They arrived through the 18th century, brought the cunning folk herbal tradition from the British Isles, and combined it with what the Cherokee and Choctaw had taught them. The German Pennsylvania immigrants came down through the Cumberland Gap in the late 1700s and brought braucherei. In the Ozarks, the equivalent practitioner was called a power doctor. That term comes from powwow doctor, same root tradition. Then there were the Africans. Enslaved Africans in the South brought a 5th tradition, root work, herbal knowledge, ritual. Some of it had originated thousands of miles south in West Africa. By the 1860s, all 5 traditions were a fully blended American thing. A scholar at Western Kentucky University, Jack G. Montgomery Jr. calls it the most accurate way you can describe it. A unique American hybrid folk tradition. 5 cultures, 2 centuries of layering, 1 mountain medicine. So, what did the granny woman actually do? In a working Appalachian community circa 1920, she had 3 intertwined roles, and most women who held the title held all 3. She was a midwife. In eastern Kentucky between 1900 and 1950, this was effectively the only available form of obstetric care. She was a healer. She knew the plants on the surrounding mountain, which one for what, in which season, in which dose. She made teas and poultices and salves, and she was a magical practitioner. She recited prayers and chants over wounds. She used water and salt and Bible verses. To her, these 3 roles were a single thing. Healing was healing. Let me give you a specific example. In 1901, in the hills of Jackson County, North Carolina, a woman was born named Susie Cook McMahan. Everyone in western North Carolina called her Granny. She served as a midwife for several decades, and by the time she stopped, she had personally delivered more than 2,000 babies. She traveled by foot or horseback through the mountains in any weather. Families couldn't afford to pay her, so she received textiles, livestock, potatoes, pieces of cured meat. If a family was struggling, she refused payment entirely and came back a few days later with food and clothing. She carried a satchel. Everyone in the county called her Big White Bag. Inside, 2 metal pans for boiling water, cloths cut from old clothing, a homemade mask and gown, and homemade soap with natural plant disinfectants. When a baby was born too weak to thrive, Susie built a homemade incubator out of a hand-woven basket and wool blankets, and instructed the mother to keep the baby in it for several weeks until it had gained enough weight to survive. In 1985, the Silva Herald in Jackson County ran a feature about her. She was, by then, the last living granny midwife anyone in the county could find. The pharmacy these women used was sitting on the mountainside outside the kitchen door. In 2025, a team at the Kentucky College of Osteopathic Medicine at the University of Pikeville in Twin Pike County to find out who still knew the old plant medicine. They asked around for weeks. They expected dozens of informants. They found 4. Every one of them was an employee of the university, working from family memory. The 4 of them, between them, named 14 specific medicinal plants still in active local use. Here are the 8 most central to the tradition. Sassafras, the root brewed as tea. Used for respiratory complaints, especially bronchitis. Documented in American medicinal use since before the 1850s. The active compound safrole is now considered a carcinogen, which is one of the reasons modern medicine walked away from it. Mullein. The leaves and flowers brewed as tea. Cough suppression. Cold and flu symptoms. Locals in New Mexico also smoked the dried leaves for asthma. Slippery elm, the inner bark brewed. Contains a mucilage that becomes gel-like when wet, coating and soothing the throat, esophagus, and stomach. Modern medicine still recognizes its effect on the gut. Boneset. The name comes from its use treating febrile illness and the pain that goes with it. Native American whole plant infusion was a tonic for colds, sore throat, influenza. Eastern Kentucky granny women still used the leaves as tea. Pipsissewa, the leaves, brewed, used for rheumatism. The earliest documented medical reference is 1844. That same use survived in eastern Kentucky into the 21st century. Pokeweed, American native. Shoots edible if prepared correctly. Raw seed is genuinely toxic. Berries boiled or made into jam, used for arthritis, root for hemorrhoids, Ghost pipe, a non-green plant dry to mesic Kentucky woods, the flower used for pain relief. A 2024 digital survey found ghost pipes still in widespread use across the United States for pain, sleep problems, and grief. Yellow root. The root made into a bitter liquid used as an anti-infective. 8 plants, everyone still growing wild in eastern Kentucky. Everyone with traditional uses that modern pharmacology has documented and matched against measurable effects. Antimicrobial, anti-cancer, antioxidant, anti-inflammatory. Now back to Nanny. Lenny Baucom Hudgens, 4.5 feet tall, lived in the hills of McDowell County, North Carolina. Her great-granddaughter, Nikki Chester, was interviewed by the Smithsonian Center for Folklife and Cultural Heritage in March of 2025. The reporter recorded what Chester remembered. Nanny worked the way most grannies worked. She walked the mountain. She knew where things grew. She taught her great-grandchildren what to gather. Sassafras, mountain mint, spicewood, teaberry. She had a remedy for everything, and most of her remedies were the small kind, the kitchen work. When somebody in the family got stung by a bee, Nanny used snuff, finely chewed tobacco, applied directly to the sting. That treatment is older than the United States. It works because tobacco contains nicotine, and nicotine, applied to the skin, has anti-inflammatory effects. Modern medicine eventually figured out the same thing. For hives, especially in infants, the remedy was catnip tea, sometimes red alder tea. The Smithsonian Piece and the Atlas Obscura, long form on Southern Appalachian folk medicine, both document the same remedy in the same form. For flu, when the household was coughing through the worst of winter, granny women put sulfur in the soles of shoes. That sounds strange to modern ears. But there's a reason it appears in 2 independent sources covering this tradition. It was widespread. It was passed down from the 1800s. Anyone with grandparents who lived through the Great Depression in the South may have actually had this done to them as a child. For colic in infants, the remedy was stewed calamus root. Given to a colicky baby, it calmed them. These are the small remedies, the day-to-day. The kind of thing Nanny would have done without thinking, the way somebody today might reach for a Tylenol. And almost every one of them has been corroborated by independent, academic, and journalistic sources. The remedies haven't been outlawed. The knowledge of how to use them has just been allowed to die. Now here's the part the History Channels really skip. The granny tradition had a ritual layer that was inseparable from the herbal layer. And the ritual layer is what made it powerful, and what eventually made it unacceptable to the U.S. medical establishment. There is a specific Appalachian healing ritual called talking the fire out of a burn. The academic record comes from a scholar named Anthony Cavender, who published a book called Folk Medicine in Southern Appalachia. Here is how it worked. When somebody got a serious burn, they were brought to a granny who knew the burn ritual. The granny recited a charm invoking the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. While reciting it, she made a specific hand motion over the burn, without touching it. There were rules. The granny did not charge for the service. The burned person was not allowed to say thank you. Both rules existed for the same reason. The healing was the work of the Lord, not the granny. To accept payment or to accept gratitude would have interfered. The effectiveness of the ritual was understood to depend on the strength of the burned person's faith. Cavender records this matter-of-factly. The faith was part of the medicine. A modern example. Byron Ballard, a writer and herbalist in Asheville, North Carolina, still carries this tradition forward in public. Her family's burn ritual, published in her book, Staubs and Ditchwater, involves repeating a specific chant 3 times, while making a counterclockwise hand motion over the burn, without touching it. The text, and you can hear how old it is, goes, "Come, 3 angels from the north, take both fire and frost." Most granny women considered themselves devout Protestant Christians. They were not pagans, they were Christians who believed God's healing power was present in the natural world, in the plants, the water, the words. A scholar named Sarah Amos at the University of Georgia calls this Appalachian framework very animist. Spirit is in the world, the plants have it, the words have it. For 120 years, that's what the granny tradition looked like from the inside. Herbs and prayer, plants and words. And to the U.S. medical establishment of the early 20th century, it was an unacceptable combination. Now we go to York, Pennsylvania, 1929. A trial took place that year. The specifics of what happened matter less right now than what the press did with it. Reporters from New York, Philadelphia, and Baltimore descended on York. The trial involved a Pennsylvania Dutch brasserie practitioner. The press coverage was sensational and mocking. The Pennsylvania Dutch were described as backward people mired in superstition. The folk healing tradition was reframed as primitive, dangerous, embarrassing. Local officials in York responded defensively. They ordered programs of scientific education designed specifically to eradicate superstition through the introduction of scientific education, recorded in scholar Gerald Milnes's summary. Almost overnight, brochures stopped advertising publicly. The practice went underground. The York trial was one event, but it set the template. Over the next several decades, the same pattern repeated everywhere folk medicine still existed. National press coverage portrayed granny women, root doctors, midwives, and brochures as embarrassing relics. Midwives, the American Medical Association, which had been growing in regulatory power since the 1910s, used this cultural pressure to push for licensure laws that effectively made it illegal to practice midwifery or herbal medicine outside the formal medical system. State by state, decade by decade, the granny tradition lost legal cover. By the 1950s, most practitioners had stopped advertising. By the 1970s, the tradition existed only in the deepest pockets of rural Appalachia. By the 1980s, the original generation was dying. And by the time the University of Pikeville researchers went looking in 2025, the entire surviving knowledge in Pike County could be counted on the fingers of one hand. A scholar named David Kriebel did the same work for brasserie in Pennsylvania in 2006. Field research, county by county He could find exactly 8 living traditional practitioners. Fewer than half the people he spoke with in the region had even heard of brasserie anymore. That is what suppression looks like when it is done well. It doesn't require a bonfire. It doesn't require an inquisition. It just requires consistent multi-generational social and regulatory pressure to make people stop teaching their children. 2 generations, maybe 3, that is all it took. So why did this happen? It wasn't because the remedies stopped working. The 2025 Pike County paper cross-referenced every traditional plant use against modern pharmacology literature. The match is striking. Sassafras for respiratory, mullein for cough, slippery elm for digestion, pokeweed for arthritis. The top documented effects: antimicrobial, anti-cancer, antioxidant, anti-inflammatory, line up with what the granny women were using these plants for in many cases 100 years before any laboratory tested them. The tradition died because of three things, all running at the same time. Professional consolidation. The American Medical Association locking down who was legally allowed to practice medicine. Cultural pressure. The press coverage of the York trial and dozens of similar stories made the tradition embarrassing, so young people from Appalachian families who moved to the cities didn't teach it to their children. And the eventual arrival of federally funded rural medical infrastructure in the 1960s and 70s, which removed the practical urgency that had kept the system alive. Within 2 generations, the chain of transmission was broken. The Foxfire Archive at the University of Georgia documented the last of it in the 1970s. By the time most Americans read it, the system was already a memory. But the story doesn't end with the funeral. The plants are still growing. Every one of the species the Pike County researchers documented in 2025 still grows wild in eastern Kentucky. They don't need to be brought back. They never left. The knowledge is also coming back. In Asheville, North Carolina, Byron Ballard teaches workshops on Appalachian folk magic at conferences across the South. Her books are in print. Her family burn ritual is documented. In McDowell County, North Carolina, the same county Nanny lived in, Nikki Chester runs an herbal apothecary out of a 12 by 40-foot tiny home in her front yard. Her business is called Nikki's Nourished by Nature. She forages from the same mountains Nanny taught her to walk as a child, and the gap that the granny system used to fill, that is opening back up. In Harlan County, Kentucky, a 2019 investigation by USA Today found that nearly 1 in 10 women who gave birth at the local hospital experienced a life-threatening complication. That is 7 times the national average. 9% of the population of modern Appalachia, according to the Appalachian Regional Commission, does not have access to a vehicle. These are the conditions that gave us the granny women in the first place. Doctors who didn't come, hospitals you couldn't reach, a medical system that wasn't built for the people who actually lived there. Nothing about catnip tea is illegal. Nothing about sassafras root is restricted. The plants on your mountainside, wherever your mountainside is, whatever you call it, are still there. The knowledge of how to use them can't be made illegal. What your great-grandmother knew is still findable. The plants haven't moved. They never left. Whether anyone in your family rebuilds, the link is up to your family. 120 years of medical knowledge, 5 cultures of plant pharmacy, 3 roles of community medicine, 2 centuries of accumulated wisdom about how a human body works in an environment with no hospital, collapsed inside roughly 2 generations. Because the press coverage of one trial in Pennsylvania in 1929 made it embarrassing to be associated with. If you stayed with me to the end of a 20-minute video about Appalachian granny medicine, you probably already understand what kind of viewer you are. You're the kind of person who suspects there's more to American history than the version the textbooks tell. You're right. There is. There always was. Next video, we're going through the Appalachian survival tactics that came out of World War II rationing. The ones the U.S. government actively promoted, then quietly stopped teaching about a generation later. If you want it when it goes up, you already know what to do. I'll see you in the next one.